And so Nimrod is a great conqueror and builder. He builds a lot of the cities in the Old Testament that are referenced in later stories. He builds Nineveh and he builds Babel, which eventually becomes Babylon. And he establishes cities not just as Cain did, as places separate from God seeking security, but as centers from which war and man's dominion over the world becomes very apparent. So he's a great
Yes.
conqueror and he's a great builder, and those two are heavily intertwined.
Yeah, I thought that was ironic that it takes a conqueror to build the city and to build some of the first cities. Um, in kind of the later history, you think of some of the great conquerors, and they tend to be city destroyers to some degree. Perhaps, in the Mongol hordes in later medieval world. But it seems like in the early history of the Old Testament, it takes a conqueror. Um, Due to the fallen nature of man versus wild and man versus other man to first establish those cities in the first place.
And you even see that played out throughout history where great conquerors often cement their conquest with the construction of a city. No no figure exemplified that more than Alexander the Great, who has, I think he had dozens of cities named after him. So everywhere he conquered, he would build a new Alexandria.
Right, at least in some way, the conqueror often remakes a city upon conquering an existing one, or they create them whole cloth out of a new territory, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nimrod is the first to do this and really establishes that connection in the Old Testament. Now, what he also does is not just establish cities as centers of war, but centers of man's dominion over all creation. So he builds the city of Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and these cities are representative of wideness, eternity, and force. Thus, this is a symbolism that man is now conquering time, space, and power, and gaining dominion over the world via the city. The city is his vehicle and his tool to gain these different powers over nature. And a great example of this is the city of Rezin, which he builds, which means bridle or bit, which sounds weird, and that's in relation to horses, the bridle of the horse, which just sounds very odd until you understand how important of a technological development the bridle and the bit were in ancient times. It basically was the ultimate weapon of war now that you had horses. It was a means of communication now that you could domesticate horses, and even agricultural development. You could plow a lot better with animals.
Yeah. So both kind of get at the same idea of the city conquering nature, right? Effectively eating the natural resources around it to construct something new and organized. And the bridle does the same thing in taking the wild horse and domesticating it for man's purposes.